Good evening. I'm Mike Kenny, Director of the Bennett Institute for Public Policy at Cambridge, and I want to welcome you to this evening's event, The End of Free Markets and the Return of the State. It's hosted by the Bennett Institute for Public Policy in collaboration with the Cambridge-INET Institute and the Faculty of Economics, both based here at Cambridge. So just before I introduce you to our speakers, and I'm going to start a conversation with them, let me just go over a few introductory points, and that will also enable more people to join before the event itself starts. The first thing to say is that the event is being recorded, but the attendees, you the audience, can't be seen or heard. After the event, we'll post the recording of it on the Bennett Institute YouTube channel. Shortly, there'll be I'll talk to our two speakers about some of the ideas in their books. And then there'll be an opportunity for you to put questions to them. To do that, if you go to the bottom of the screen and use the Q&A option, and you can send your questions, please say who you are, and I will put some of those to the speakers in the second half of the discussion. For those of you that like to tweet, please use the hashtag Coyle_Sandbu. So let me introduce our two speakers to you. If they can join me on screen. There they are. So Martin Sandbu is the European economics correspondent at the FT. Where he's been based since 2009. Before then, he's worked as a policy advisor, and he was previously an academic, gained a PhD at Harvard, and subsequently taught at UPenn, Columbia, and Harvard. With him, we have our own Professor Diane Coyle. Diane is Inaugural Bennett Chair of Public Policy based here at Cambridge and co-director of the Bennett Institute with me. She's also involved in a number of different advisory roles with government here in the UK and beyond. At the Institute, she leads two of our major research and engagement programs. One of those is on progress, ideas of what we value and how we measure economic activity. The other is a major program on productivity. And I know she'll be drawing on some of the ideas and findings from the project she's leading here, as well as talking to her latest book. Both of our guests have published important recent books about the economic causes of some of the major political and policy challenges of our time. One of the big themes of Martin Sandbu's book, which you can see the cover of here, is the challenges posed by the emergence of the so-called left behind. And he's got a diagnosis of that and various policy proposals of how to deal with that. Diane, in her book, which is here, Market, States and People, offers reflections on the kinds of tools and some of the insights that economics offers to policymakers. One of the most important things about these books, I would say, is that they are a pleasure to read, and they are of huge interest to non-economists like me, and I'm sure like many of you. Both are published by Princeton University Press, and the press are offering a discount on these books tonight. You can buy them for 40% off their cover price. I think a code will be appearing to help you do that in the chat. Rebecca will put that in shortly. So to start with, I'm going to ask each of them to just introduce their key arguments in their books for 5 minutes, and then I'll follow up with some questions. So let's start with you, Martin.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. Thanks everyone for watching. I'll do a sort of whirlwind tour of what the book's about, and then we'll get into discussion. But forgive me if this is sort of very cursory. I'll encourage you to read the book, but then I would. The book really came out of my reaction, sort of my, if you like, therapy to the populist shocks of 2016, the Brexit referendum and the Trump election, and the general rise of what I've seen as populist reactions to what we have tended to call the post-war liberal economic order in many countries in in the Western world, by which I mean basically the advanced countries, the ones we used to call the industrialized countries. I've seen that order as having three parts. There's a kind of political part, the liberal democracy proper, elections, rule of law, all of these things. An economic part, which we can basically summarize as shared prosperity. The economy works for everyone and sort of roughly shares the fruits of productivity growth equally. And the third component is international openness, economic, political, and so on. And I think those three aspects describes what came out of the immediate post-Second World War settlement in all the most of the industrialized countries. And it was sort of the ideal for a long time. It seemed to win in 1989. And then within a decade or two, it was on the defensive. And it seems to me that the offer from those who have represented the backlash against that model is really focused in big part, or relies in big part, on the second aspect, the economic aspect. They say, this hasn't worked for you. It has failed, the post-war liberal order has failed its economic promise of shared prosperity, so throw the whole thing out. I mean, that's one way I would summarize, let's say, the offer of Trumpism. Throw out the liberal democratic norms, throw out the multilateralism and the international openness, and then we'll fix this. Throw out the elites that ran all of this. Now, I start the conversation with that observation because I think it's really important to see and recognize the economic basis of the political conflicts we've had in the West in recent decades, and in particular since 2015, 2016. If you count Europe, you have 2015, 2014, the European elections then. Even though there's obviously a political and cultural aspect to this conflict, you need to think about the economy, partly because if we want to have solutions, ways to overcome it, some of those, I think, will be in economic policy. That is, in some sense, the easiest bit to change. But then you also need to get the economics right. So a big part of the argument I make in the book is that, unlike what many people say, including good centrist liberal Democrats, it's not globalization that's gone wrong in the economy. I argue basically globalization is a scapegoat. And I'll just bring up one fact to illustrate why I think that. If you take any G7 country, any industrialized country, you'll see pretty much the same thing. Two observations about the data. One is industrial employment, the number of factory jobs pretty much peaked in the late 1970s, give or take a few years depending on the country, but that's kind of when you had the highest absolute number of people in factory jobs. Since then, steep decline. Some people have said that that's a single chart that explains Trump, for example. And although a lot of different people have voted for this populist movement, it seems clear that it's disaffected the kind of native working class that has often tipped these movements over the edge to get into power or get close to power. But the other important observation is that if you look at industrial output, so how much factories produce, the amount of manufacturing goods actually produced in all these countries, that didn't peak in the 1970s. It kept growing in the 1980s and the 1990s, flattened a bit in the 2000s. But in most industrial countries, in most rich countries, industrial output is as high as it's ever been. So it's not that industry went away. It's not that the Chinese stole our industry. It's that the jobs disappeared. And I think that is sort of a quintessence, if you like, of what I think has changed. What's really changed is technology. It's how we produce things. We just don't need as many people in the jobs that used to produce manufactured goods as before. The high value-added jobs today are in different sectors. They tend to be in very knowledge-intensive service sectors. And that change is partly driven by technology and in some sense, I think, inevitable. Partly, I think it wouldn't have gone away if we'd globalized less. Some of it, automation, for example, might actually have gone faster because shipping jobs to China is a substitute for machines. But if you want to understand how we can make things better to try to overcome the sort of inequalities that have been created by this, you need to recognize that technological change is not going to be reversed. Now, in addition to all those technological changes, a shift from an industrial society to a knowledge economy, you had a lot of policy choices from the 80s on that didn't really tackle that change very well. Depends on the country. Some countries did much better than others in tackling this change. But on the whole, you didn't really see policies trying to counteract the worst manifestations, the worst consequences of these changes. And what these changes led to was essentially to count in favor of some groups and against other groups. The shift from industrial to knowledge economy benefits big cities. It benefits people who have a high level of education. It benefits people who are good at cognitive stuff. It benefits people who are comfortable with change and variety and diversity and dynamism. And it doesn't benefit so much people who are better at manual work, people who don't have a high level of education, who don't have high cognitive skills, who maybe prefer to stay in a smaller place rather than a big city. And you can sort of see how I'm kind of drawing up the voter groups that have a line on the two sides of this sort of cultural conflict, but that I think to a large extent is an economic conflict. Policies didn't really do as much as they could to counteract or compensate or address that change, to make these changes benefit everyone. So, you know, we are where we are. One example of that is looking at tax policy, for example. The technological developments I mentioned, they have led in some countries to a shift of national income from labor to capital, in many more countries to a greater inequality within labor, where the high earners have become richer and the poorer earners have been left behind. And you can also see this in a territorial sense. You know, the cities move ahead, whereas the lagging areas fall further behind. But tax policy doesn't seem to have you haven't had the sort of tax policy that would have compensated for that. Instead, you've seen on the whole a lowering of the burden of taxation on capital, a lowering of the highest labor tax rates, and so on. But there are many other examples we can maybe get into in discussion. So in the book, I sort of set out a number of proposals for dealing with this, and I won't be able to go through those now in the initial remarks. But the overarching theme is that we want to embrace technological change. We don't want to hold it back or pretend that we can save the old jobs. We want to quite actively get rid of the old jobs, but then work hard on getting good, newer jobs, better jobs to more people in more places. And more places is perhaps the most important part of this. We need policies that will not try to resist the way the structure of the economy changes, but make that work in more places. That's very hard, because left to itself, the sort of market dynamics of this kind of technological change is one that actually has unequal effects, as I've pointed out. So you have to work with the grain of technical change, but in a way that manages markets and shapes them in a way that we haven't been very good at in the last 40 years. What that, you know, the title of the event is about the state and the role of the state. So this is going to be my last observation to start with. We have blamed globalization by saying, look, globalization has left nation states unable to deal with these problems. I think that is wrong. I think the nation state has not used a lot of the tools that it actually has. And part of what we need to do going forward is not to give up on globalization, but use that domestic policy ability much better. So a return of the state, if you like, it's not so much necessarily a bigger state, although that depends a bit on the country, but I think using the state much more intelligently and unlearn what I think of as a learned helplessness among national policymakers. So I'll sort of leave that as a teaser, since I'm already over time, and let's move on and we'll get back to some of the details.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much, Martin. Over to you, Diane.
Thank you. Thanks for that introduction, Martin. Good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us. I share quite a lot of that diagnosis with Martin, certainly thinking that technology is one of the important drivers of change. But my book grew out of a very different kind of concern and an earlier period. It was a concern about what economics we were teaching to people in the wake of the financial crisis. People who wouldn't become research economists, but were going to go out and get jobs in public policy, in the civil service, or in business. What was it that we were teaching them about the way to think about the economy? And so this book grew alongside another initiative that I was involved in, the core economics curriculum. And in particular, what I wanted to do was reintroduce to public policy economics some bits that had completely dropped out of the curriculum since my day, which was quite a long time ago. And that's economic history and welfare economics, or in other words, the analysis of what it means to make things better for a nation or a community. What do we mean by things, by progress or things getting better? And that took me to two big messages in the book. One is about the way that the right kinds of policy choices are not right for all time. They're always going to depend on history, on geography, on technology, and different places at different times will have to select different policy mixes. So it's just much less abstract than we have come to think about it in the world of economic policy analysis. And the second message was about the aims and thinking much harder than we often do about what exactly is it that we're making better and for whom. And then that brings to the foreground those issues of inequality that Martin was just raising, and the way that technology has driven greater inequality on different dimensions, but affecting the same people in the same places. Those left behinds that Mike talked about in his introduction. And if you think about those messages, then the market versus state debate that has characterized a lot of economic policy discussions since the Thatcher era isn't just wrong, it's actually counterproductive. Because there's a rich array of economic institutions. Markets are one kind. We now talk about designing markets, thinking about the structure of regulations and the rules of the game. States at different levels, what kind of agencies, independent bodies, which are public sector, national governments, local governments, but also businesses, community organizations, unions, babysitting circles. All of these, in their way, are economic institutions that need to be part of the landscape that we think about in thinking about what interventions are needed to make what better and for whom. And so there's an interplay between events and economic ideas and political choices, and these cycle over time. And we had the cycle that started with Thatcherism and the idea that the state was too big and should go into retreat. And that dynamic in itself, if you like, unleashed markets, and alongside the technology drove the inequalities that we see now. And I think not only the financial crisis, but the pandemic are going to be some of the nails in the coffin of that way of thinking. Events are going to change policies and the way we think about economics as well. So the standard textbook approach that you've got individuals making rational choices in a free market context, which is the sort of default benchmark for thinking about policies. You think about that ideal, and then you think about what are the failures that you're facing and the specific interventions that are needed. That's a poor guide to thinking about allocating and distributing resources in our modern, networked, intangibles, increasing returns, very unequal economy. Having said that, we do have economic tools that can help answer questions about the economy that we actually have. How do we think about the provision of these non-rival digital goods, which are like classic public goods in many ways, except they are owned and operated by large foreign multinational companies? How do we think about competition in digital markets? What about the ownership and regulation of natural monopolies, which we now have a rich array of different patterns of ownership and regulation? What if we're in a context where people are not making so-called rational choices, but we're in the world of having to think about behavioral policies? What should we think about contracting out public services? Why is it okay for hospitals to contract out payrolls but not ophthalmology? And how do we think about the differences between different countries' structures for providing health services? How do we think about inequality? Do we care if Benedict Cumberbatch is very rich? And if not, why not? And when we do about investment bankers? So all of these are the kinds of immediate policy questions for which there are really powerful economic tools. And so I hope you all go away and read the book, but the chapters go through some of these different contexts and try to apply the lessons that we can bring from economic analysis, but also the lessons that we need to take from the political context and the historical context and the technological changes that are going on.
Great, thank you very much, Diane. So that's a really good, and both of you have done a great job actually distilling some of the key ideas that run throughout the books. There are lots of other arguments as well. I'm going to try and just in a couple of questions with you draw out perhaps some of the surrounding ideas and arguments that go with those particular ideas. Can I just start with you, Martin? I mean, I think one of the, maybe two questions really to start with. One of the really striking things about your book is that the challenge, I guess, you offer to what's become a pretty established narrative about globalization, which is that globalization is the source or one of the key sources of a lot of the political turbulence and the disenchantment and the inequalities that are driving populism. You're quite adamantly against that idea. My two questions really for you. One is why do you think policymakers bought into the narrative of globalization? Because that's a key part of your argument, that there is this, I think you call it learned helplessness, which that story gives policymakers, and that has all sorts of important negative ramifications, you think, for decisions they make. It's one thing. And then just secondly, is there a danger, and I know this is a question you've had before, but is there a danger that in making the economy, the economic pillar, the main pillar of your account of what's going wrong with the Western order, that in a sense you diminish the cultural and the political aspects of this? And is some of the inequality we're thinking about, doesn't that also register in terms of people's feelings of identity and how they feel about politics? So just take those two in turn.
Thank you. Very, very good questions. I mean, I think on the, why do people blame globalization? I mean, first of all, these changes are hard to understand, right? It takes a lot of work and there's a lot of debate. Mine is not, I don't think, the most common view. Maybe, in economics, there's a sense that technology is a bigger driver of inequality than globalization, but these are disputed, let me admit that, right? So I'm towards one corner on this. And so that in itself is kind of the start. It's not, you don't look at the world and you see the causes. Causal mechanisms are hard to understand. But I think, there are some features of modern democracies, or maybe any democracy, that makes it worse. I mean, one is that it's easier to notice the stories about the jobs that are shipped off to Mexico or China or Eastern Europe. And of course, there are some of those. They're the ones we watch. They're the ones journalists write reports about. They're the ones that are easy to, if you're in opposition in politics, to blame those in government for. Whereas we don't see so much the loss of jobs because there are new machines in place. The new jobs that come because of globalization. The sort of big churn that happens in the economy all the time. There are many more jobs being lost and created every year than the net loss or net gain of jobs. But these are kind of hard to see and hard stories to tell. And then, of course, if you're a politician, it's easier to blame the other guy, and it's even easier to blame the other guy if the other guy is in a different country. So there's sort of a natural tendency, I think. If you want to look at it in this country, most sensible politicians in the UK certainly most sensible politicians in government and front benches in the UK have understood that the criticism of the EU is far overdone. But it's always come in very handy to blame Brussels for things and not have to take the fight early on about how this is not actually Brussels' fault, but something we need to fix on our own and can, and they're not stopping us. So you end up seeing in 2016 that when David Cameron tried to give one speech trying to defend the EU after the entire political class has found it useful for 20 years to blame the EU for things, it doesn't work. These are narratives that take a long time to settle in and then to unlodge. So I think, those are some of the reasons. But I think also, as you said, learned helplessness. I think sometimes it's just been hard to navigate the new global environment. And you have to be kind of creative to see how you can use national policy in a new way in a more open, more rules-based international environment. Part of what I tried to do to write the book to do was to say, look, here are all these things that we can do at a national level, and we haven't really tried them. So let's at least try before we say that globalization makes this impossible. Just on the economic pillar, forgive me. The question was.
So the question is, in sort of really prioritizing the economic
right.
And saying, this is what's shaking
Right.
the order.
Yeah.
Are you letting the liberal centrists off the hook, really?
Look, it's also cultural, and of course it's both, right? It's cultural and psychological and values, and it's the economy. And to link up a bit to what Diane talks and writes about, economists kind of need to learn to understand the cultural expressions of grievance, right? You can't tell people, oh, you can just move to the city if all the jobs have disappeared in your hometown. But my claim is that these cultural value differences get activated politically because of economic change. People just don't get angry in the same way if things are going well economically for them or for people like them. So that's why, in some sense, I think economics is at the root of this. And it's certainly the thing that is easier to change with policy. Not easy, but easier than changing people's opinions about whether they want an authoritarian leader or whether they like foreigners.
Okay, thank you. I mean, Diane, coming to you. I think one of the interesting sort of connections between your book and Martin's is that you've also got quite a strong account in there of changes in the economy, and particularly, and you touched on this in your opening remarks, the role of technology and how, yes, partly it has a disruptive effect in things like the labour market and the nature of production. But I get the sense you think beyond that as well, that it presents challenges in terms of how the kind of tools we use to understand economic behavior and economic patterns in a digital context. I mean, do you want to just draw that out a bit and just tell us a bit about what you think we can understand using some of the economic theories and ideas you discuss, and what we don't understand so well, and where you think the gaps are?
That's a big question, and I suppose digital markets and the technologies just pose lots of challenges, and it's partly that things are so disruptive, but it's partly that they have such distinctive characteristics. So in the opening comments, I said they have many of the features of classic public goods. They have a high upfront cost, so you've got to finance that in some way, but then the costs of lots of people using them are extremely low. And how do you find a way to cover the initial costs by getting people to pay for them? Well, it's pretty difficult. With technologies, we have ended up with a model that it's advertising that largely pays for these free digital services. And at the same time, they have a lot of what's in the jargon called network effects. So the more people use them, the better it is for the people already using them. So they've got these natural monopoly characteristics as well. And you could say that, well, that might take us back to a very old debate about should we nationalize these companies or not? well, we can't because they're not ours, they're global and they're domiciled in a different jurisdiction, so we can't do that. But it's why we have got into this debate about should we have utility regulation of the big digital companies. So a lot of the old tools do apply, but in different ways in the policy context. We've always had some of these tools, but competition authorities around the world are only recently starting to think we need to update our practices and the guidance that we use to take account of the fact that so many more markets are like these now, and we've not been used to dealing with that. So what are we going to change? And there's a very active policy debate about that. I just want to pick up on Martin's comments on globalization. This is one of the areas on which I've changed my mind over time. And like many economists in the 90s and early 2000s, I would have said globalization was unquestionably a good thing. It was good for everybody as consumers. It was like technical progress shared globally. And of course, there was going to be short-term disruption to jobs, but that was the task of policymakers to figure out how to address those short-term disruptions. But as it turned out, we did that really badly. In the recession of the early 80s and the 90s, we failed to address that disruption for people. And we failed to think about people as producers as well as consumers. So if you were living in one of the Rust Belt towns or towns in Northern England or the West Midlands, you could indeed buy many things much more cheaply than you could in the past. But if you didn't have a job and an income, that wasn't going to do you any good. And so there was too much disruptive change too quickly, got concentrated in particular locations, and policy was actually completely hopeless at addressing that. And I think in a way, one of the things that we forgot about in thinking about globalization and outsourcing a lot of production to other countries was that it's not just that people's identity and incomes are shaped by the jobs that they do, but also that there is engineering know-how attached to these activities and located in particular places. So this specificity of the tacit knowledge, the know-how, and the location of jobs and the historical context and the speed of change all mattered much more than I would have thought 20 years ago. So I'm actually much less of an evangelist for globalization than Martin comes across in the book.
I mean, let me just so put that straight back to you, Martin, but also thinking about this in the context of policy debate now about the left behind specifically. I mean, you are clearly pretty confident that you believe that the era of economic openness ought to be restored, or that we stay with that. But you also clearly think there are lots of policy interventions that could now make a difference to people who are struggling in terms of their economic prospects and in some of the ways that Diane's talking about. I mean, just what's your response to that? What is the policy recipe that you think now is needed to deal with the left behind?
Yeah, I mean, we need to, first of all, establish the diagnosis, and it's sort of unhelpfully nuanced in a sense, because I certainly agree that globalization hasn't done much good for the left behind. What I dispute is that their plight is on the whole due to globalization. Of course, there will be cases, but it's not as if we would have wanted today to have all the jobs that existed in manufacturing in Western countries 50 years ago, right? A lot of those were, assembly line jobs. That's not really what we should aspire to. Maybe for some individuals that would be better than nothing. But on the whole, the good jobs in industry, the way it is still done in the UK and in other Western countries, they're precisely the high quality, knowledge intensive jobs with very high skill, engineering jobs, for example. They're not the jobs that a lot of people would have in any case. So, let's not fall into the trap of thinking that promoting, let's say, manufacturing would necessarily be a huge job creator for the people we worry the most about. It probably wouldn't. And kind of one more nuance to what Diane was saying. There is a thriving car industry. Well, there was one until the pandemic in the UK now that relies entirely on globalization, right? It relies completely on tying into a international European scale supply chain. Deglobalizing that, which is what Brexit will to some extent do, is a huge threat to that kind of jobs. The very best jobs are in fact global jobs for global markets. So this is a sense in which I think globalization is not in conflict with economic development at home. But I accept that the last 40 years of globalization hasn't done much good. That's not the same as saying it's caused the plight of the left behind, but it hasn't been made to help them. So what do we do? Well, I think what I want to do is kind of a little bit to park the globalization debate and say, actually, that's sort of neither here or there. We want to equip as many people as we can domestically to be productive. And if we can do that, then having access to global markets is actually going to work in their favor, rather than trying to develop while closing our national economy off from the rest of the world. How do we do that? I think a first step has to be to actually take issue and reject a model that relies on low-paid, low-productivity work, which this country does to some extent, the US does to some extent. So in the book, for example, I advocate for a pretty ambitious use of minimum wage policies and kind of work standard policies generally, to quite actively try to discourage the bad jobs and incentivize companies from making jobs more productive. There's an example I use that I find at least very helpful in my own thinking, which is the very modest job of the car wash. So I grew up in Norway in the 80s, where the only way you could wash your car was do it yourself or go to one of these big machines with the big blue spinners. I lived in the US in the 2000s, where the standard way was to kind of drive your car in and have 3 or 4 immigrant men descend on your car with washcloths. Why the different technologies for achieving the same job? Well, one obvious reason was that you had to pay, the one person manning the service station in Norway much more than the 3 or 4 people washing your car by hand in the US. But actually, we should think of it the other way around. The fact that the service station in Norway had invested in the machine meant that it could pay more for the jobs that it still had. Whereas in the US, the fact that you could get away with paying very little meant that there was never any reason to install that machine in the first place. And Diane said we need to understand economic history. The automatic car wash was invented in the US, right? In the 30s, 40s, spread in the 50s. There was a time where that was a technology that was deployed. A labor-saving, capital-intensive technology. Again, this is a very pedestrian example, but I think it goes for thinking about the economy as a whole. You want to get rid of the bad jobs, and to do that, you need not only to create the incentives for companies to choose more capital-intensive, more technological, more productive ways of organizing labor. But then the supporting policies to make sure that more of those jobs are created as the bad ones disappear.
Okay, Diane, just one final question for you, then I'm going to open out to there's lots of questions coming in from the audience on these sort of issues, so we'll be carrying on. Just going back to your point, you emphasized history, tacit knowledge, the specific characteristics, I guess, of different places. What does that mean in terms of a public policy sort of set of answers here? I mean, who is it likely or possible that, say, the central state is going to be able to understand those places well enough in sufficient detail to connect with that tacit knowledge to come up with the right kinds of intervention?
So you won't be surprised to hear that I think the answer to that is no. I mean, the central state has the responsibility to provide, if you like, insurance against the kinds of shocks that people couldn't possibly insure themselves against. And so it will always have to finance the kind of help that places need when they face such shocks. But they don't have anything like the granularity of information that they would need to bring about a transition, any kind of smooth transition. So the car industry was one where we did manage to get in some big overseas investments through specific efforts, and we made that a much higher value added industry and created the supply chains and the exports, as Martin said. But there were others where that didn't happen, textiles, steel, and the communities involved didn't remotely get anything that would help them. They had a dollop of central funding for people to set up their own small businesses and do entrepreneurship, but in a context where there was no demand for the services that entrepreneurs could possibly supply, given the scale of the shock. And there was no understanding of how you might increase the value added of the textiles industry. It took another 30 years at least before the skills that existed in the Northwest started to be used again to develop much higher value added specialist textiles outfits. And the things that people in places know how to do are much, much more specific than the categories in which we think about economic policy. We think about, oh, let's have a biotech, or let's have an AI or an electric battery industry. The technologies that are relevant are just much more specific than that. And so we have ended up with foolish policies that say everywhere's going to have its own biotech center, when that can't possibly happen, and the nation can sustain one or two at the global frontier. So it's the information aspect of place that I think we have really been missing from some of these policy solutions.
Okay, thanks very much. I mean, there are so many different things that would be good to follow up on, but some for another time. Let me just now bring in some of the questions that have been coming in from the audience. We've got one question here, or we've got a number of questions actually on COVID. You won't be surprised to hear, and I think we should put at least one of those to you. So somebody here, Alison McGovern, has talked about what seems to be the apparent conflict between economic objectives that the government's thinking about and the public health objectives in dealing with the pandemic. What are the lessons? What lessons should be drawn from economics in how to align those objectives better and to improve policymaking in the context of the pandemic? That's a very broad question, but Martin, do you want to just pick up on that one? The sense of, it's felt like at times there's a conflict between these objectives.
Yeah, I don't think there's a conflict. I think you find, and the IMF has recently come out and said the same thing, that the faster you basically suppress the virus, the better your short-term economic performance will recover, the faster it will recover. Partly because then you need to have shorter lockdowns, and partly because people aren't as scared and don't stay away from normal economic activity. But I think there's another economic aspect to the pandemic that is, in a sense, much more important because it's longer term. And it's that it reinforces some of these changes that Diane and I have been talking about. In two ways at least. One is that it kind of intensifies the inequalities and the unfairness that we've already seen grow over the last few decades. The people who are in manual work, sort of physical presence, work that requires physical presence, are both more exposed to disease or more exposed to hardship, economic hardship, because of lockdown, social distancing requirements. So it enforces the inequalities that we already had in place, whereas people in jobs like ours can, okay, it's a bit boring to sit at home and stare at Zoom all the time, but we can keep doing our jobs. In the future, and this is a second element, it's very likely that the sort of adaptations we've made in the pandemic, everyone's been on a crash course in technology. That may very well also continue to intensify the same dynamics. The fact that we're all now much better at remote working, teleconferencing, video conferencing, and so on, is probably going to boost the knowledge sectors even more than was already the case, right? We've sort of been pushed down the natural road of progress that we were already on. And at the same time, you see that some of the jobs that worse off people do, retail, for example, is now disrupted by online retail, right? It's not as if people who are now buying a lot more on Amazon are going to go back to buying things physically to the same extent that they did before. So we're having some permanent shifts here that even if the vaccine they all work, they're all distributed, and there's no coronavirus anymore 6 months from now, we're not going to go back to where we started. Just final thought about this, could we think of ways to make this work in our favor, as it were? Ours, I mean, sort of national economies and cohesions, what I in the book call belonging. One thing I'm really intrigued by is whether we could think of policies that make this remote working experiment actually allow us to rethink the territorial distribution of prosperity. Can we bring more of those high value added, high paying, good jobs to more places? Or is it all just going to shift a little bit from city centers into the very nice immediate suburbs? Or is there some way we can use policy to encourage greater relocation, greater spread of that sort of work?
That's exactly one of the questions we're very animated by at the Bennett Institute. Diane,
the person to answer that question the best, of course, is our colleague Flavio Toxved in the economics department. I don't know if he's actually on here tonight. So I have felt really strongly since the start of the pandemic that a policy failure was not integrating the economic advice and the epidemiological advice in SAGE right at the start, because that allowed this perception that there was a genuine trade-off to come about. And the government has never had both sets of arguments or been able to present to people the fact that it has considered all of the possible implications of less activity in the health services in other ways because of what was happening with COVID, mental health impacts and so on. You can integrate the different disciplinary insights, and that really should have been done at the start. And it's one of the reasons we had that very damaging debate about there's a trade-off between the economy and public health. And that speaks to one of my hobby horses, which is the need to integrate not only in research but in policy across silos. If you're thinking about people in deindustrialized areas which have become areas of multiple deprivation, you cannot think about policies separately. You've got to think about the health and the education and the housing and the access to nature and the transport and communications links all at the same time, and pile in on all of them to make things better. And if we do it one by one, if we don't join up, then we're not going to see any change in these inequalities that we've been talking about this evening.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to put a different question to you, which comes from Antonio Macedo, which is, he references Joseph Stiglitz's book Progressive Capitalism to make this question, but I'll just abbreviate it because I think it's a very interesting sort of political question or political reflection on some of the things you've been talking about. Are we in a moment, it looks as if we're in a moment where there is skepticism about the free market. It's become established fairly widely across the political spectrum, and where arguments for a more interventionist state, be it a central state or devolved state, seem to be gaining momentum. Is your sense, both of you, that that's likely to continue as a trend, or is something else like, are we going to kind of come to a new sort of balance really between in our thinking about the state and the market, which I think you hinted at, Diane, in your opening remarks? Do you want to start with that one?
I think we've always had quite an interventionist state, and the share of government spending in the economy hasn't declined. We've had industrial policies in this country for the financial sector through deregulation and infrastructure provision, in pharmaceuticals through tax benefits and research funding. And I think what's changing now is a sense of intentionality. That learned helplessness, in Martin's phrase, is being unlearned, and so I don't think it will go away. And I think the pressure of the inequalities and the discontent is such that if it isn't addressed by policy, then it's going to burst out in some other much less appealing way.
Martin?
Yeah, I think the state is back in a sense, but let me explain how, because I agree with everything Diane just said. The state has always been there, of course, but in a sense, it's been in a largely kind of compensatory mode. It's sort of seen markets do their work and you try to compensate the worst effects. And then maybe you have some add-ons that are nice to have, research spending, for example. And I think intentionality is a nice word for it. There is some sense that maybe, a sense that planning is possible, I think, has come back. And this was already happening before the pandemic, but especially now. And again, you see it at the sort of, the guardians of the orthodoxy are starting to embrace this. The IMF, for example. There is a sense that it's possible to shape markets, to shape the way market mechanisms work. That's much more ambitious than what we had until pretty recently. I think some of that has to do with the fact that we need to tackle the inequality problem and the regional disparity problem. But it also comes from climate change. I think that this is now such an enormous problem. It's one that economics can help us understand very well. We know what externalities are. We know that we need to internalize them. There are good economic theories for thinking about it. And the problem is now so big that we need the right policies to make that happen. And I think over the last, 2019, basically, you saw a big political shift, but also an intellectual shift in very senior policymakers, basically starting to embrace the idea that this is possible. States can actually be proper agents for shifting this economic trajectory. And here are the ways we do it. Now, of course, comes the political battle of actually making those choices. But I think applied economics, if you like, or economic policy making as a field has sort of made the shift.
Okay, thank you. So one more question I'm just going to put to you from the audience, then one last one from me. And this is a question about populism, which we've sort of touched on and skirted, I guess, so far. But it's really a question from Baobao Zhang, who's a postdoc, and who has asked the question about the degree to which populism and its attacks on facts and evidence-based policymaking sort of challenges at the root the possibility that, or increases the challenge, the difficulty of developing the kind of wise policies that you in particular are talking about, Martin, and also whether populism to a degree is like a virus that gets in the way, Diane, of the kind of insights and ideas that you want to bring in from economics. So just a couple of thoughts on that quickly from either of you. Martin, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I think it's right. It makes it harder, but I think we need to admit, and this is something I try to grapple with in the book, that it's originally our fault, by which I mean sort of well-meaning centrists, liberals, because the populists were the first to point out something that's true, namely that some of you have had a really bad deal over the last 30, 40 years, and that just wasn't being admitted by the broad center of the political spectre. There was some compensation, but on the whole, the narrative was that things are getting better and better. And a lot of people's real experiences were just not reflected in the way people in leadership, the elite, if you like, talked about things and described the world and the challenges they faced. So the populists saw a political opportunity. They can say your life is shit and nobody else is admitting it even or will do anything about it. So throw them out and bring me in. That's a pretty powerful sell. And that's why we have a lot to make up in terms of creating a way of proposing a way to manage the economy in a way to which the left behind belong. This is why I call the book An Economics of Belonging. It's a vision in which everyone belong, but that's also realistic and can be carried out, which the promises of the populists cannot.
Brexit was a really big shock to the UK economics profession because we were so united in thinking it was an obviously terrible idea. And I think one of the things populism has taught us is that it's not feasible, it's not sensible to say, here is a fantastic economic analysis that tells you what the right policy is, if only the politicians would implement it. If the politicians can't implement it, actually you've done the analysis wrong. That has to be part of how we think about it, and political economy is back. The other concern I have about some economists is that there's a sense of standing outside society and deciding what's best. And so the idea that you can do happiness to people by imposing the right policies is something that really troubles me. And again, I think we need to think much harder about what it is we think our aims are. What is it that we're doing to make things better, and on whose behalf are we speaking?
So that's the great answer, particularly because it tees up exactly the question I wanted to ask both of you to finish. We hadn't scripted that. And it's so the final question really about, it's prompted by the word belonging, actually, Martin, that you just mentioned. And you know, it's very interesting that you foreground that term and you talk about the importance of thinking about belonging. I guess you mean in both in an economic sense and a broad political sense. I just wonder though, if, following up what Diane said, we also need to think hard about identity. And maybe one of the things we've learned through the recent, the crises that have affected us politically since 2016 is about the importance to people of their identities, particularly place-based identities of various kinds. And I just wonder what you both think of, or how you think economics, in particular, maybe social sciences in general, deal with issues of identity. Is this something that we as social scientists need to take more seriously, do you think? Martin, you go first.
I certainly think economists need to take it more seriously. There are other social sciences that take it seriously, although in different ways. But I think, I mean, one big almost original sin, if you like, of much economic theorizing is this pretense that economics sort of takes people's preferences as given. You know, we don't tell you what to prefer, we just work out, like engineers, what sort of market mechanisms then get us to the best possible result. But of course, most economic models and a lot of policymaking tools are based on very specific and narrow assumptions about what people care about. So this is an objection to how utility theory has been used in practice. But it's not just a theoretical concern. You know, every time an infrastructure project or a policy is assessed in the government, in the Treasury, there is a cost-benefit analysis imposed. And cost-benefit analysis is essentially a sort of crude form of, a faux sophisticated, I should say, but philosophically crude form of utilitarianism. So there's an intellectual problem there. But a simple way to put it is that, you know, people care about their communities. Of course they do. Identity, you know, a kind of very simplistic way of thinking about identity is that it's an expression of some of the things that you care most deeply about and that you are not willing to trade off against other things, or if you do trade it off, it comes at a psychological cost. But these are things that are important for people, and so of course economics should value it too, right? That should really go without saying, but in practice, that's not what most economics and applied economics has done. In practice, what that means is to, yes, take place very seriously, because place is a very deep source of identity. That doesn't mean we can't, we should try to kind of preserve places in aspect, if you like. We still need to embrace change. A lot of what my message is, we need to try to make change safer for people. Identities develop too, and people have multiple identities, and a lot of what life is about is to kind of balance your different identities. But yes, we need to take it more seriously, but we can do that actually. It shouldn't be inimical to economics to kind of look around and see what people are really like and respect them for it.
Thanks. What do you think, Diane?
I agree with that. I mean, it helps explain why we're not all criminals when we could earn so much more by doing that, or why we won't move for jobs when we could make much more money going somewhere else. Having said that, I don't think we should become amateur ethnographers or anthropologists in economics. And, you know, we should hold back from that kind of economic imperialism. But it clearly matters, and, you know, speaks to my earlier plea for more interdisciplinary work. And we should talk to the anthropologists and the sociologists, even if we're not going to do that ourselves.
Terrific. Well, that's a really good note to end on. Thank you to everyone who posted a question. I'm sorry I only was able to put a few of those to our speakers. Let me just close by reminding you that if you're interested in the work we do here at the Bennett Institute, and we've touched on a number of projects and programs tonight that we're actively working on, please do go to our website for more information. Follow us on Twitter. The next big event in our calendar is a lecture by the CEO of UKRI, Dame Ottoline Liza, on the 7th of December. She's going to be talking about UK research and innovation towards an inclusive knowledge economy, which follows quite nicely from some of the discussion tonight. And then finally, let me just say thank you, first of all, to the Bennett events team, particularly Rebecca Learn, for putting all this together. And above all, to our speakers, because I've thrown quite a few different issues and ideas to them, and they've responded to them all in incredibly interesting and thoughtful ways. So thank you both very much. I commend their books to you, and thank you all for tuning in. Bye-bye.